Adding explosions to your game can really make a big difference in how professional it looks and how fun it is to play. I've just got a quick example program here where if I click once, it provides an immediate explosion and a few delayed explosions as well. I'll show you how to do that. And of course, if I click all over the place, then all sorts of carnage breaks loose. So let's have a look at how we can program this. Just to be clear, what's happening in the main function, I have if mouse is pressed, then I actually create 4 explosions, and this last number attribute here along the end, the 0, 15, 25, and 45, is actually the number of frames that I want it delayed by. And that's a really cool effect if you've ever played the game 1942, when large enemies eventually blow up. There are lots of little delayed explosions. It really looks fantastic, and it's pretty easy to add that delay effect, so why not? So let's jump into how to actually make the explosions. Now, if you haven't watched the spawning and destroying video, I really suggest you get your enemies and your bullets spawning and destroying first, because I won't have time to fully explain those things, but you'll see a lot of the same things happen here. We'll have a list full of explosions. Now, I really want to highlight that almost all of the time, the absolute best thing you can do is make your explosions independent of your enemies and your bullets. What do I mean by that? When you discover that a collision has happened between a bullet and an enemy, for example, my suggestion is you spawn an explosion in that spot, or multiple explosions with delays and all sorts of stuff, and then you delete the enemy and the bullet, and they're gone. The explosions are there, but the enemies are gone. And trust me, it'll make your life so much easier in so many cases. So think of the explosions not as part of the enemy, but something that's left behind when it has died. Obviously, once the explosions are finished, they'll need to be deleted as well. How do we create an explosion? Well, I've just made a function here called createExplosion, and again, it makes a local variable explosion. Again, I'm not going to explain this too much. Go and watch the video on spawning and destroying if this doesn't make sense. But basically, it will need an X position, a Y position, a size, and an active is true. Now, also notice that the function here, the user, can actually give you all of this information. The user, for example, not the user, I should say the enemy, if it's creating an explosion before it dies, it will give its own X position and Y position for the explosion, and then the size, and then finally the delay. The delay is actually the number of frames here, so delay of 60 would be 1 second, because there's 60 frames in a second on the update function. Now, once we've created the explosion object, there are a few more things we need to add below. The reason I put them below here this one thing, sorry, explosion.frame, is because it has a calculation here, and so I can't put it inside here. So explosion frame equals 0 minus delay. This is really clever. So if the explosion gets called with a delay of 10 frames, for example, the explosion frame will be set to minus 10, and in that way it won't be shown until the frames have finished being shown. I should make a correction there. By the way, the delay will be not the number of frames per second, 60 frames a second. It'll be a delay of frames, but it depends on how fast your explosion is actually going through its frames. And in my case, it's 30 frames a second, but it doesn't really matter. You can play around with the numbers and find out what works for you. Just a note, if the user does not enter the final parameter and they only enter 3 numbers, then delay equals 0 means that 0 is the default here. So now that we've created an explosion, let's go and look at what this explosion actually looks like. So if I go across to sprites, you'll obviously need to import an explosion sprite, and here's the one that I've done. There's one on the website that you are welcome to use. I think it's this one actually, but you can also get your own sprite sheet. On the sprite sheet, you'll highlight the first, or select using the select tool here, select the first explosion, and there should be an option to chop it up into a smaller sprite sheet. You've probably seen that with player animations, etc. An interesting thing for explosions, though, is I would really like you to, and you'll see why if you don't do this, I'll let you work it out, but I really suggest you add an empty frame at the start for frame 0 for the explosions, just because you don't want it showing up before it's actually started going through its animation cycle. That will help it stay invisible. Also, we need to note that the last frame here is 16. It's important to remember what this number is. I should say that this automatic animation is really good for things like player, sprites, or whatever, but it is useless for explosions because we will have multiple explosions that will be using the same sprite, and we don't want them all to be exploding at the same time necessarily. So, deep breath, we are going to have to write our own animation code. It's not actually too bad. I'll show you how to do that now. So when we, what should we look at first? Let's just look at drawing the explosions. So drawing the explosions, again, we're going to have to go through the list. If you haven't watched the other video, please go and watch it. For item in explosions, you could call this explosion or E if you wanted to. So we're going to draw we're going to draw this sprite, and these you should all make perfect sense to you based on what we've done before. This might be a bit confusing though. Basically what this means is sprites, and then in brackets whatever our explosion sprite is called, it's called explosion up here, you are going to basically set the frame of that, and the set frame, and you're going to set it to item.frame because we are actually controlling the frame that is being shown ourselves. You might be really confused as to what this floor does. That's simply, let's say it was on frame 13.5, that would just take it down to the floor, to the nearest whole number, which would be 13. So 13 would be taken to 13, 13.5 would be taken to 13, 14 would be 14, 14.5 would be taken back to 14. It's very similar to time. A second only ticks over once you've got the whole way there. Now you might say, why on earth would I ever have a frame like 13.5? Well, if you look at our update explosions here, we're actually advancing the frame by 0.5 at a time, because if I add a frame on every actual frame, a whole frame, it goes too quickly. That would be the same as 60 frames a second, which would just be way too quick. I want 30 frames a second, roughly, and the way that I get that is I only add on half a frame each time. So if we have item.frame, now, once we've added that on, what we're going to say, if item.frame equals 17 or more, then we actually want to say item.active equals false, and then it doesn't get added to the temp list, etc., etc. But why 17? So once it equals 17, why do we want to delete it? Well, if we go back in here, you'll see that the last frame is 16, so by the time it gets to 17, that's too far and it should be deleted. If you don't delete them and you have lots of explosions, they'll still be there, hidden from you, and if your game starts to slow down, you will know why. Anyway, I hope that helps going over how explosions work. It is a little bit complicated, but it's definitely worth the effort. Please come and get some help if you need it.